This is the Samsung G880SD. Now, I had high hopes for this monitor. You see, last year, Samsung had actually put a decent amount of good OLED panels. So I thought that with everything they've learned, this new generation of Samsung OLED monitors will be the panels we've been waiting for. Brighter display so that you have something that you can actually call an HDR experience, and an extremely fast input lag due to that OLED response time. The problem is, Samsung are not the only ones thinking like this. Does this display actually match up? Well, first of all, I'd say that it's not in the background, so I think that kind of answers that question. Now, to be fair, it's not something you entirely write off because it could well work for a few people. The purpose of this video is not to say this monitor is bad, don't buy it, but it's really to give you an idea of what it's going to be like using this monitor and see if it's something you can put up with. Let's dive in. Now, before we talk about anything, let's address the dollars in the room. At the time I picked this monitor, which was pretty much within the launch month, it's going for about 1800 Canadian. I think that's a little bit on the high side. You could actually get a 55-inch S90C OLED TV for the same amount, and I would argue that that's a way better HDR experience. You can't even compare both of them, but I digress. It even becomes more apparent when you consider the fact that we have Alienware, MSI, Asus, other displays that are offering very similar features, sometimes even more features, for anywhere between $200 to $300 less. However, if you took a second look at the monitor and you allowed its gaze to mesmerize you, you'd soon discover that Samsung's ace of their sleeve is probably none of the features. It's really how good their monitors look, man. Look at how slick they've designed this thing. The subtle curves you see at the rear side of the monitor, the way they've designed the nice orb that actually provides some nice background lighting on your wall if you have it close up to the wall, almost making me wonder if it's still a monitor I'm describing here, but you get my point. This is by far one of the best looking gaming monitors I've ever seen, period. Surely there may be those that prefer something that's a little bit more overt, but this very understated minimalist design really works for a lot of people. Now, if you were brave enough to pick up one of these matte displays, what do you get out of the box? First of all, you get the stand assembly. Now, this consists of a dense metal base plate, and this stand allows for height, tilt, and rotation adjustment. The hinge design on this stand is the best hinge I've used on a monitor, period. It's very smooth when you're rotating or adjusting the tilt or any direction, and there's not a lot of play when you're actually, in fact, there's pretty much zero play, but obviously it still wobbles. By far the best monitor hinge for a stand I've seen ever. Now, of course, this is VESA compatible as well, 100 by 100. So if you didn't want to use the stand and use a monitor arm, you could definitely do that. I also like the fact that the stand doesn't come with one of these long V's and it's just a base plate. So that doesn't take up as much space on your desk. You can put stuff on top of it as well. So that's a win there. You also get the display panel itself, and this is incredibly thin. I was scared actually getting this out of the box, but there are instructions on how to lift it out, and it's quite firm and sturdily built. Now, the edges are not sharp. They actually have like a slight curve. I think this is better to make it easy for handling the monitor itself, mounting it and all of that. Getting it out of the box, it has a protective film on the screen, so you don't have to worry about fingerprints getting smeared in it while you're bringing it out of the box. You also get a bunch of input cables, which I don't feel like the best quality in the world, but they are fine. You get an HDMI 2.1 cable, a DisplayPort 1.4 cable, a USB-C B port cable, and let me just say this is the first time in my life I've seen this port before. I've never used it in my life. I don't see myself ever using it in my life, and I don't think I'm the only one that's in that position. I've noticed that a lot of all the other OLED monitors, for some reason, do not have a USB-C downstream port, one that delivers power as well, so you can have a one monitor setup just like you would if you had your MacBook Pro or something like that. The choice of this port is a very Samsung decision, that's what I'll say. And then you also get the infamous power brick at this point. It seems like with each display Samsung releases, they keep on making them bigger. This doesn't need to be a trend, right? I guess the reason they've always gone with this is how thin they like to make their displays. Possibly not have to deal with heat issues, but for some people this might be a big deal. You always have to account for this big brick in your setup, which can be annoying. And then obviously you get the manuals and some paperwork. Now, when it comes to assembly, I would say surprisingly this was really easy. In fact, I think this is the easiest monitor setup I've ever done. I like the fact that you can set this up with no tools and you can take it apart with no tools. So first of all, you put the base plate down, you just insert the stand into the stud and twist it clockwise. It snaps into place and you're good to go. If you want to take it out, you just look at the bottom and there's a button you push to release the mechanism, and then you can take it out. Then you will just line up the display itself along the hinges and clip it into place and you're good to go. So setting this off is extremely easy and I do appreciate that. So once you're done assembling the monitor, you redo the initial setup. Now, for the uninitiated, all Samsung monitors now come with their smart TV OS called Tizen. This is the OS you find on their smart TVs, essentially making their monitors smart monitors. Some people don't like any of this. They just want the thing to be a monitor and nothing else. But one thing I will say is that of all the Samsung displays I've used, including the M8, the S9, S90C, which is one of the best value OLED smart TVs you can get right now, in my opinion, I can say that the G8 is the most responsive compared to all of the rest. And I kind of expected that because they actually have the same AI chip that's in their 8K displays. Again, one of the reasons why I felt this display was supposed to be like one of the best things we'll be seeing, right? Sadly not the case. Now, of course, with these smart TV features, this allows you access to your favorite streaming apps like Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV, and the likes. When you actually turn on the monitor for the first time, you'll be greeted with a setup screen. It's a series of questions it's going to be asking you through the initial setup process, like your email, password, things like that. The initial setup process does require an internet connection, so depending on how fast that is, it may extend how long your own initial setup takes to complete. So a lot of the issues that happen at launch, they try to address them during the firmware update. And I will say, compared to some of the other monitors out there, updating the firmware on this monitor is very easy. Rolling back in case there were any issues, that's another conversation, but at least updating it is pretty easy. Now, during the setup process, you have the choice of doing this either on your phone or on the remote. I recommend you use the remote if you have an Apple device. I would imagine it might be better if you're using a Samsung device. Why that is the case, we shall never know, but just be aware of that. After you've gone through all of this, a cute little animation will play on your screen and you're good to go. So for some reason, I completely forgot to talk about this part, but this is the ports you get on this display. But again, I'll just run the labels on here so that you know exactly what you're looking at. So a little bit of house cleaning here. Let's quickly go through the raw specs of the G8. So this is a 32-inch 4K QD-OLED screen, and this maxes out at 240 Hertz with an input latency of about 0.03 milliseconds. In SDR, this would max out at around 240 nits, and in HDR, it can get up to 400 nits. In some scenarios, in like a 2% window, they claim it can get up to 1000 nits. Based off of my experience, that's more at around the 750 to 800 nits. In terms of the color space, this covers all of the color spaces that you'd be interested in. sRGB, it's 100%, DCI-P3 is 99%, and 79% Rec 2020, which is the highest I've actually seen for any OLED display this year so far. And as a gaming monitor, it also supports VRR, G-Sync, and FreeSync Premium. Also, another thing I wanted to talk about is cable management. Now, with the monitor, it has a silicone strip that goes to the side, and you're able to route all of the cables through the side of the stand. Now, you would think that maybe running it through the center is a better way to go about it aesthetically, but it actually works better going through the sides because it makes it more practical in rotating the display. And I think it's actually neat regardless how they've done it. The stand is almost like one of my favorite aspects when it comes to this monitor. I like the way they've done the grille. It just gives it this premium look and makes it stand out compared to most of the other monitors. So in this segment of the video, we're going to be talking mostly about the display, SDR, the matte finish, HDR experience, what all of that looks like. So starting out with the very touchy subject, the matte finish. Now, this is something that's highly debated in the monitor display space. Some people feel a matte finish is great, while some others feel like a glossy finish has a zero compromise to the actual display quality, even if you have to deal with more reflections. What I'm glad to say about this particular display is that its matte finish is one of the better ones. It seems to offer the least amount of compromise when it comes to clarity and sharpness, and does a really good job in dissipating the light and spreading across the screen in such a way that they are less distracted. The other downside with the matte finish on the G8 itself is that it appears to raise the black levels on this thing. The way it disperses light can make it appear as though that the blacks are gray, and you really don't want that when you're dealing with an OLED display. If I'm going to do OLED, I want the full smoke. I want to know that what is coming out of the screen is 100% what I paid for. Moving over to SDR experience. So what they've done is that they've combined the best parts of quantum dot with OLED. So what that overall means is that you're going to have higher peak brightness than typical OLED panels can generally get to, and also increased color vibrancy in some certain colors, so to speak. Speaking about the SDR experience on this monitor, it's mostly fine. If you're playing a bright game, you're not going to struggle. Even if you're playing in a brightly lit room, it's going to look good. However, if you start playing more of a dark game, maybe something like Lies of P, Resident Evil 4 Remake, or any of the Resident Evil games that tend to be dark, you might feel that sense of, I wish it was a little bit brighter. You can kind of crank the brightness all the way up in game mode. Game mode tends to push the brightness a little bit higher. In terms of like the SDR experience, I think it's pretty good. Just know that in darker games, you might need to maybe switch into a completely dark room to get a better viewing experience in there. Now, I would have easily just said that the SDR experience is not really much of an issue here, but when you have it side by side with previous monitors like the M8 and the S9 that I have, in my opinion, I feel like they shouldn't even be on the same realm of comparison. Like, we shouldn't even be having a close matchup here. But surprisingly enough, the M8 and even the S9 was keeping up ranks with the G8, which I just felt was complete sacrilege to me. Now, switching modes over to HDR, what's that experience like? Now, Samsung says this can get to around 400 nits in HDR and then can get up to like 1000 nits, maybe like a 2% window. That's not entirely accurate. I'd say it's more around the range of like 750 to 800 nits in that 2% window, and you're dealing more around 380 to 390 nits in a typical HDR scene. Yes, you will feel like, oh, you've switched to HDR, but in comparison to like actual TVs and displays, you're not really going to get that high HDR experience. Again, lending to the fact that I personally feel like in a desktop setup, you need to be hitting 500 to 600 nits to get that HDR experience. So the S9 is an IPS panel, horrible black levels by the way, but amazing HDR and color volume. When you play games in HDR mode on the S9, it really does pop, and that's one thing I really did not give it enough credit for when I even did that review. And even though that was an IPS panel, it almost outshined the OLED in HDR, which is sacrilege to say, but it is what it is. So let's talk about the motion clarity on this monitor. Now, I would say motion on this display is amazing. The G8 gets up to 240 Hz. Now, to access the 240 Hz refresh rate, you do have to be in game mode. Otherwise, you'd be capped to 120 Hz. In gaming, when you're watching movies or especially doing productivity tasks like video editing or photo editing, it's absolutely perfect. There's nothing I could say or criticize around this. And with no surprise, the input response time is very quick. Given the fact that it's an OLED display, already tells you that this is going to have fast response rate. I think it's around 0.03 milliseconds. For you to really take advantage of this high refresh rate, you do have to have a PC that can drive those higher frame rates. You won't really get the benefits if you're not doing something like 80 to 90 frames per second. But if you have a rig like RTX 4080, by all means, enjoy. Suffice to say that motion clarity on this monitor is absolutely amazing. Now let's talk about game mode on the G8. Now, almost all Samsung displays come with game mode now. So typically to activate this, you go to the menu. So you will just hit the home key on the remote and go all the way to settings. And then you should see game mode and select on or auto. Then you're able to use the shortcut to the game bar, which is holding the play button on the remote for like 3 seconds and the game bar will pop up. In the gaming hub is where you also have access to all of your game streaming services. Those like Game Pass, Nvidia GeForce Now, Amazon Gaming, and some of the other ones. In my opinion, I think the only two worth trying are Nvidia GeForce Now and Game Pass, and yes, in that specific order. Nvidia GeForce Now tends to be the best when it comes to input latency and just overall picture quality. But the next best thing to that would be Game Pass. So yeah, give this a try if you have decent internet access. Now, apart from the fact that it's a high refresh rate monitor, supports HDR and all that good stuff, this also supports all of the sync technologies that matter. And it works how you expect it to work. The issue it has is VRR flicker. Now, personally, I didn't even know that VRR flicker in gaming monitors was a huge deal because I have a QD-OLED TV, the Samsung S90C, and I've always done VRR on it and I've never experienced any flicker. Maybe a few times, let me say like 5% of the time, but there was never a widespread issue. But when I played those same games on the G8, there was VRR flicker a lot. Now, Samsung did release an update that added a new setting, which was called VRR control. And what this essentially did was it took out all of the benefits of VRR, but just without screen tearing. So you had worse input lag, choppy frame rate, granted no screen tearing, but the motion looked horrible. I actually was able to sort of fix this issue. And what I essentially did, at least for my scenario, was was to set the power profile to maximum performance on the GPU. So I use an RTX 3080. I have the Alienware R12. I capped the frame rate wherever I needed to. And then once I set it up this way, most of the flicker generally goes. The only other thing that seemed to be effective against VRR flicker was once you set the frame rate cap to above 60 frames per second. So once you get it to like 70 frames per second or 80 frames per second, then the VRR flicker tends to go. The minute it dips below 60, you start to see VRR flicker. Now let's talk about what the overall console experience is like. I'm testing this mostly on the PS5, and for all intents and purposes, all of the features you would need here work perfectly fine. VRR works well. HDR experience is very good as well. Also, when you do the PS5 HDR calibration and you do it well, it looks stunning. Specular highlights specifically look really good on this monitor because when you're in that 2% window, it can actually get to like 800 nits. So at that point, specular detail is very high. So let's talk about the color space, color gamut, everything this monitor has to offer. Now, it's an OLED display, so you're always going to expect great colors. However, where this monitor actually does excel in comparison to its competition is the coverage in Rec 2020 specifically. So I'll break it down this way. So sRGB, 100% coverage, DCI-P3, 99% coverage, and you have Rec 2020. It gets up to 79%. Now that might not sound awesome on paper, but it's actually really good. This is actually the highest coverage I've seen in any OLED display. Most of them are like 72, 75%, 76, but 79%, this is by far the highest I've seen. And what that means is colors in HDR are going to look more accurate and much more vibrant. Also, just for context, I'm going to throw in some B-roll that shows you what the clarity is like when it comes to text. Text fringing is usually something that people like to know about. And I'll say text fringing on this is quite minimal. You tend to notice it more in OLED displays generally, but I think the pixel arrangement on QD-OLED makes it such that fringing is handled a little bit better. It's not completely gone, but it's better. Now, sound on the G8. I mean, this is something that I wasn't even thinking too much about, but I can say that apart from the Apple Studio display, this is surprisingly the best sounding integrated speaker I've heard on a monitor. And then also the 3D sound stage that it has actually works. It does a great job in projecting the sound around the monitor. It doesn't have that rumbling, crackling sound effect that the previous displays like the M8 or the S9 had. If I'm not mistaken, I think I did have some comparison about that. If I don't have it, you just have to take my word for it. Now let's talk about burn-in and burn-in prevention. This is part of the reasons why I ended up returning the G8. To put it into perspective, there's this guy, I think it's a hardware unboxing, and he had a QD-OLED display that he used for about 3 months, and there was some image retention, though it wasn't egregious, but there was some image retention. I'm thinking in 3 months, you're getting something little. What's that going to look like in like 2-3 years? Because this is not a cheap monitor, and most people who will get this monitor will have it for at least something like 2-3, even possibly 4 years. But to be fair, on the G8, I think in my opinion, they've done a good job in lots of the burn-in prevention they've put in there. For example, it has logo auto detect, which means if there's a static logo on the screen, it kind of adjusts the brightness in some way to prevent it from affecting it adversely. It will do like a pixel shift where it's moving the entire image ever so slightly by a couple of pixels, just to make sure that the same exact pixels are not used all the time. And then it also has like a type of screensaver that if you leave the display unattended to for a while, it'll go into the screensaver mode where it's completely black, and it has like an array of colors that go on the screen to prevent it from just being a static image all the time. So what are my final thoughts on the G8? Here's what I'll say. Full transparency, I returned mine after 2 weeks. I did so for a number of reasons. Number one, I felt like the experience I got from it after 2 weeks was a little bit underwhelming. In HDR, it didn't get as bright as I hoped it would. Even though I know that the colors are amazing, it just didn't look as good as the S9. And it just kind of put me in this place where I'm like, I don't think I want to keep this. And then also the VRR flicker was a little bit more intrusive than the Samsung TV that I have. I have the S90C and I use VR on it all the time, and I hardly ever see flicker. Maybe just during the loading screens, but when I'm actually playing the game, I hardly experience flicker. But on the G8, it was definitely much more noticeable. Those are some of the things that contributed to making me return mine. So if these are things that are going to bother you, I'd recommend you look elsewhere. But if you want to go ahead and get it, don't think that, oh, this is a horrible experience. No, it's actually one of the better ones. But for me personally, it just falls short in the areas that mean the most to me. And I think a good number of people find those things important to them as well. So for me personally, I'm just going to wait for the next generation of QD OLED displays as a whole. Hopefully this helps you, give you an overall informed opinion on the G8. Let me know what you thought. Is there anything I missed out? Until the next one, stay safe and have a great time.